The War Council chamber of the Galactic Dominion was built to intimidate. A vast, domed construct of obsidian steel, it swallowed sound and reflected light in strange, distorted ways, making even the most battle-hardened warriors uneasy. It was a place where the strongest gathered, where the galaxy's fiercest species convened to decide the fate of lesser civilizations. Today, however, the chamber carried an unusual tension, an undercurrent of something unspoken yet palpable. At the head of the chamber, towering over the others, stood General Korvac of the Thraxians. His species was the undisputed apex of warfare, a civilization forged in unrelenting battle. His carapace gleamed under the artificial lights, his four crimson eyes sweeping across the gathered representatives with something between amusement and disdain. The Thraxians had never lost a war, never retreated, never faltered, and yet the humans sat at the back. Korvac exhaled sharply through his spherical vents, a sound akin to a scoff. Across the chamber, warriors of various species occupied their seats according to an unspoken hierarchy. The closer ones sat to the front, the more respected they were in matters of war. The Thraxians naturally commanded the center. The others, some strong but ultimately secondary, arranged themselves accordingly. And then, at the very back, barely noticeable, sat the humans. General Korvac's mandibles clicked together in irritation. He turned toward his second-in-command, a warrior named Vakrin, who was equally perplexed. "They do this at every council," Korvac growled, his voice like grinding stone. "Always taking the rear seats. Tell me, Vakrin, what do they fear so much that they refuse to sit among warriors?" Vakrin tilted his head, considering. Perhaps they lack the spine for war. It is not in their nature to be first in the charge. Korvac grunted in agreement. The humans were a strange species, too small, too fragile. Their role in the Dominion had always been a curiosity. They provided technology, strategy, intelligence, but never force. At least, not in any significant capacity. The Thraxians had long dismissed them as weak, barely worth consideration in the grand theater of war. And yet they lingered. From the shadows of the back row, Admiral Elias Kane of the Terran fleet watched the proceedings in silence. His expression was unreadable, though a faint smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. Around him, the other human officers sat with an unsettling calm, as if the War Council was little more than a mild inconvenience. He met Korvac's glare with an almost casual air, then leaned back at his seat, fingers steepled. Across the chamber, discussion turned to the latest conquest, the war against the Vesker, an insectoid species that had dared challenge the Dominion's might. As expected, the Thraxians had led the charge, and the result had been absolute annihilation. The Council reviewed battle footage of the Vesker homeworld, now little more than smoking ruins. Korvac swelled with pride. Another species brought to its knees. Another victory for the Dominion. He turned his attention to the humans, his voice tinged with mockery. "Tell me, Admiral Kane, why do your people never lead these wars? Surely, even the fragile need to prove their worth." Kane didn't answer immediately. Instead, he exhaled slowly and glanced at the footage of the destroyed Vesker world, as if considering his words carefully. Finally, he said, "Because we don't have to." A ripple of quiet amusement passed through the other species. Some chuckled, others merely observed. Korvac's mandibles twitched in irritation. "You mean to say you lack the stomach for war?" The Thraxian pressed. "You prefer to sit in the shadows while others win your battles?" Kane's smirk widened, though his eyes remained cold. "Oh, we have the stomach for it," he murmured. "But tell me, General, where are your dead?" Korvac stiffened. The question was unexpected, but not without merit. The Thraxians prided themselves on minimizing casualties, their superior strength and tactics ensuring their survival in battle. "We are warriors," Korvac replied proudly. "We do not fall like lesser creatures." Kane nodded. "Interesting." Before the conversation could continue, a sharp alarm pierced the chamber. A holographic projection flickered to life in the center of the room, displaying a live transmission from the outer colonies. The image was grainy, chaotic, something was wrong. A battered Thraxian officer appeared on the screen, his face twisted in sheer terror. His voice came through in a panicked rasp. "General, gods help us. The Zalvith have returned." The chamber fell into stunned silence. Korvok's breath hitched. That name. Impossible. The Zalvith were a nightmare consigned to history. A race not merely of conquerors, but of consumption. They did not take territory. They did not enslave. They devoured. Planets, species, entire civilizations erased. The last war against them had been thousands of cycles ago, and the cost had been so great that the Dominion had declared them extinct. And yet, here they were. The holographic feed shifted. The footage was brief, but it was enough. Black, writhing masses poured across a ruined battlefield, overtaking Thraxian warriors as though they were insects. Those who were caught did not die. They changed. Their bodies twisted, reshaped into something unholy. Korvok felt a chill run through him, something utterly foreign. Fear. The other species erupted into a frenzy. Some shouted for immediate military action. Others whispered in terrified disbelief. The War Council, a place of ironclad confidence, was now a den of uncertainty. Admiral Kane simply watched. Vakrin turned to his general. "Orders." Korvok hesitated. He had never hesitated before. A heavy silence settled over the chamber. Then from the back, Kane stretched, rolled his shoulders, and muttered, "Well, that complicates things." Korvok's head snapped toward him. You knew." Kane didn't answer. Instead, he turned to his officers and in a low, calm voice said, "Stand by." The human officers nodded as if they had been expecting this. Korvok clenched his fists. You knew they were coming. Kane met his gaze, and for the first time, there was something in the human's expression that sent a chill down the Thraxian spine. "We had an idea," Kane admitted, "but you wouldn't have listened." Korvok's mandibles ground together. "And what exactly do you plan to do?" Kane exhaled through his nose, then finally rose from his seat. "We'll do what we always do," he said simply. "Wait." Korvok bristled. "Wait? You expect us to?" "Wait," Kane repeated. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of certainty. Across the chamber, the other humans remained seated, their gazes steady. The emergency transmission continued, the screams of dying warriors echoing through the chamber. Korvok turned back to the projection, watching as the Dominion's might was torn apart like paper. He had never been afraid of war. But as he looked back at the humans, still sitting, still waiting, he realized for the first time in his life that he had no idea what kind of monsters he was dealing with. The fortress world of Cordith, 7 fell in less than an hour. It had been a stronghold of the Dominion for centuries, a bastion of military might fortified with planetary shields, orbital defense grids, and legions of the strongest warriors the galaxy had ever produced. The Thraxians had stationed an entire armada there, confident that no enemy could break their lines. The Zalvith did not break their lines. They unmade them. The first transmission had been garbled, filled with static and desperate screams. Then the planetary defenses went dark. The last footage received before the blackout showed a towering wave of writhing black tendrils rolling over Thraxian formations, consuming warriors in seconds. The creatures moved with terrifying grace, not simply killing, but reshaping their victims into something else. Grotesque amalgamations of flesh and shadow, thrashing, screaming, joining the swarm. Now silence. Inside the War Council chamber, the aftermath of the transmission settled like a heavy shroud. No one spoke. No one moved. The strongest species in the galaxy had just witnessed their finest warriors disappear into the abyss. And still, the humans sat at the back, watching, waiting. General Korvok's massive frame was rigid with disbelief. He had never seen the Thraxians routed before, had never known what it was to fear an enemy. The sensation clawed at him like a parasite, unfamiliar and repulsive. He forced himself to breathe, forced his hands to unclench. There had to be a strategy, a counterattack. There always was. "We strike back immediately," Korvok growled, his voice raw but firm. "We mobilize every fleet, every soldier, every weapon in our arsenal. Vakran hesitated. General, we don't even understand what we're fighting. The records on the Zalvith are ancient. No known strategy. Then we will make a strategy, Korvac snapped. We are Thraxians. We do not die. The voice was quiet but carried through the chamber like a blade through flesh. Admiral Kane, the humans have been silent throughout the briefing, their expressions unreadable, their posture unsettlingly relaxed. Now, Kane leaned forward, fingers steepled, his cold blue eyes locking onto Korvac's. Because that's what you're about to do. The chamber turned toward him, some with curiosity, others with anger. Kane gestured lazily at the holographic projection. That wasn't a battle. That was a harvest. Your soldiers weren't fighting an enemy. They were resources being gathered. The Zalvith aren't here to conquer. They're here to grow. Korvac bared his fangs. And what would you have us do, human? Sit back. Do nothing. Kane exhaled, almost amused. Oh, you can fight. If you want to hand them more bodies to work with. Dark murmurs spread through the chamber. The reality of the situation was setting in. The strongest warriors in the galaxy had become fuel for something worse. A new transmission flickered onto the hollow display, grainy, unstable. A soldier, his armor scorched, his eyes wild with horror, screamed into the feed. They're not dying. We kill them, and they stand back up. Gods, I saw. Hecklin, the soldier's voice broke into ragged sobs. Hecklin was dead. I know he was dead. And then he turned. He turned and ripped out my captain's throat. A sudden shriek. A blur of movement. The soldier screamed as something yanked him off screen. Then, static. A heavy silence followed. Even the air in the chamber seemed still. The Zalvith were not just killing. They were recycling. One of the council members, a reptilian strategist from the Zarnak species, turned his slitted eyes toward the humans. You, he hissed. You are calm. Too calm. What do you know that we do not? Kane glanced at him, tilting his head slightly. We know what happens next. Korvac's patience snapped. He slammed a fist against the war table, cracking the reinforced steel. Enough riddles, human. Speak plainly. Kane sighed and stood up. He walked toward the center of the chamber with measured steps, as if he had all the time in the universe. When he reached the holographic map of the war front, he studied it for a moment before speaking. We fought something like this before, he admitted. Not the Zalvith, but close enough. And we learned something very important. Korvac narrowed his eyes. And that is? Kane looked up. If you try to fight them like a conventional enemy, you've already lost. A tense silence settled over the chamber. Then, a quiet, bemused voice from one of the human officers. Well, on the bright side, at least we won't have to worry about body disposal. The joke landed like a lead weight in the room. A few of the aliens looked horrified. A Thraxian soldier let out a sharp exhale that might have been laughter before, silencing himself immediately. Kane smirked. Look, I get it. You're warriors. You don't back down. It's admirable. It's also exactly what they want. Vakran's mandibles clicked uneasily. What are you saying? I'm saying, Kane continued, that your strength is what's killing you. He turned back to the holographic battlefield, highlighting a segment of the Dominion's forces still engaged in combat. You're built for conquest, for hand-to-hand battle. But the Zalvith don't fight, not in the way you understand. They spread. Every time you charge into their ranks, every warrior you send against them, you're feeding them. You're giving them more of you. Korvac clenched his fists. The truth was sinking in, and he despised it. A new signal crackled through the comms. It was fragmented, barely comprehensible, but the words cut through the static like a blade. Dominion forces, falling back, Thraxian fleet. Compromised, Zalvith on board, They're in the ships, they're in the ships, Then, only silence. The chamber filled with a low, trembling hum of warriors realizing they were out of their depth. Kane sighed and rubbed his temples. Well, he muttered, there goes plan A. A Zarnak officer hissed in frustration. And what is plan B? Kane rolled his shoulders. Plan B is simple. The chamber leaned in. Kane smiled. We wait. Korvac snarled. Wait for what? More of our people to die? More of our fleets to fall. No, Kane said, his voice low. We wait until they're fully committed, until they think they've won. And then, his smile faded. Then we show them why humans always sit at the back. No one spoke. Korvac, for all his fury, found himself at a loss for words. For the first time in his life, he understood something deep in his core, something he had never considered before. Humans did not sit at the back because they were weak. They sat at the back because they were waiting for the moment everyone else failed. The Dominion's last line of defense shattered in 17 minutes. 17. That was how long it took for the Zalvith to tear through the remaining fleets, breach planetary fortifications, and gut the core worlds from the inside out. The War Council's chamber, once a den of confidence and calculated aggression, had become a tomb of silence. The strongest species in the galaxy, the warriors who had forged their empires in blood and steel, now sat frozen as the horror unfolded before them. The Dominion was dying in real time, and there was nothing they could do. General Korvac's massive frame was rigid as he watched the destruction play out on the holo display. Entire fleets consumed, cities collapsing beneath the crawling tide of the Zalvith. Every desperate counterattack absorbed, twisted, repurposed. His people, his warriors, were gone. And yet, the humans still sat at the back. Korvac turned toward Admiral Kane, fury and disbelief warring within him. "This is what you wanted?" he demanded, his voice dangerously low. "To watch us fall?" Kane didn't respond immediately. He simply watched the screen, his face unreadable. Around him, the other human officers remained disturbingly calm, their postures loose, their expressions unreadable. It was infuriating. Finally, Kane exhaled and looked up. "No," he said quietly. "This is what we expected." The Thraxian general felt something snap inside him. He surged forward, towering over Kane, his fists clenched so tightly that his claws dug into his own palms. "You knew," Korvac snarled. "You knew this would happen, and you did nothing." Kane didn't flinch. His icy blue eyes met Korvac's burning crimson ones, utterly unshaken. "No, General. We waited." The War Council erupted into chaos. The surviving species turned on the humans, shouting accusations, demanding answers. How could they have sat back while the greatest military forces in the galaxy were torn apart? Why had they refused to fight? Why had they not led an offensive? Kane let them yell. Let them vent their fear, their anger, their desperation. Then, when the voices finally started to die down, he did something none of them expected. He smiled. It wasn't a smirk of arrogance. It wasn't the grin of someone who had just outplayed his enemies. It was the smile of a man who had seen this before. Kane turned to one of his officers. "It's time," he said simply. The officer nodded and pressed something on his wrist console. The chamber's lights flickered, and for the first time, the holo display changed. Not the images of war, not the images of devastation. Something else. A countdown. Korvac's mandibles clicked in confusion. "What is this?" Kane's voice was disturbingly calm. "The reason we waited." The timer was counting down from 3 minutes. Vakran's throat vibrated with unease. 3 minutes for what? Kane's smirk widened. For the Zalvith to realize they just made a mistake. Before the council could react, a new transmission flickered to life. Not a distress call, not a plea for help. A signal from deep human space. The voice that came through was not panicked. It was not afraid. It was not desperate. It was waiting. Confirming engagement window, a cold, clipped voice said, "Targets have fully committed. Stage 3 clearance granted. Full deployment. Asterisk, asterisk, execute. Asterisk, asterisk." Then silence. And then the universe changed. Every transmission, every battlefield, every system under siege shifted. The Zalvith swarm, once a relentless, unstoppable tide, suddenly froze. Their movements, their attacks, their horrifying expansion, all came to a jarring halt. Then the killing started, but not in the way anyone had expected. It wasn't a desperate defense. It wasn't a last stand. It was systematic eradication. The holo feed zoomed in on one of the war fronts where the Zalvith had entrenched themselves. 1 second, they were advancing, flooding over the remains of a Dominion stronghold. The next, they were disappearing. Not dying. Disappearing. Like someone had erased them from existence. One by one, entire hordes of the creatures were simply blotted out. No weapons fire. No explosions. No resistance. Gone. Korvac stared in horror. What is this? Kane folded his arms. His voice was quiet, almost bored. Clean up. Vakran's claws dug into the war table. You had this power all along. Kane exhaled, shaking his head. Not power, just preparation. The War Council watched as entire battlefields reversed course. Ships once overrun with the Zalvith suddenly came back to life, their systems restored, their crew still standing as if nothing had happened. Planets that had been overwhelmed were fine. Cities that had fallen were intact. Time itself had not been reversed. The Zalvith had simply never been there to begin with. A deep, dreadful realization settled over the council. The humans had not been idle. They had been waiting for the exact moment to activate whatever this was. Korvac felt his chest tighten. What did you do? Kane finally looked at him directly, and in his eyes, the Thraxian general saw something far worse than arrogance. Pity. We let them believe they were winning, Kane said. We let them overextend, spread themselves too thin, commit everything. He gestured to the hollow feed, where the last remnants of the Zalvith forces were vanishing like smoke. Then we used something they never saw coming. Vakran swallowed. What? Kane tilted his head slightly. The one weapon we built for things like this. The war table pulsed with new data. A designation flashed on the screen, simple yet utterly alien to everyone but the humans. Erebus Protocol, Phase 3. Event Horizon Containment activated. Korvac's throat tightened. You erased them. Kane's smile didn't reach his eyes. We removed them. Vakran's voice was hoarse. To where? The human admiral's expression darkened. Don't ask questions you don't want answers to. For the first time since the War Council had been formed, the strongest warriors in the galaxy felt small. The Zalvith had been their nightmare. The enemy they could not fight, could not understand. The humans had waited for them, and when the time came, they had simply deleted them from existence. The War Council chamber fell into a terrified silence. And for the first time in his life, Korvac understood why the humans always sat at the back. The Zalvith were gone. Not defeated. Not destroyed. Gone. The War Council chamber, once filled with the tension of impending extinction, now stood in an eerie silence. The strongest warriors in the galaxy, the proud leaders of species that had ruled for millennia, sat in stunned quiet as the realization settled over them. The impossible had happened. The humans had won a war they never truly fought. General Korvac's hands clenched at his sides. His mind, trained to analyze battlefield strategy, to break enemies through sheer force, struggled to comprehend what had just occurred. The Zalvith had been erasing entire civilizations, spreading like a virus. They had adapted to every weapon, countered every tactic, consumed the best warriors in the galaxy with laughable ease. Yet the humans had undone them with the push of a button. Vakran finally found his voice. You never intended to fight them conventionally. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, one filled with quiet horror. Kane exhaled slowly, his posture as relaxed as it had been since the beginning. No, that would have been stupid. Korvac's jaw tightened. Then why did you wait? Why let billions die? The human admiral met his gaze without flinching. Because we needed them all in one place. Vakran's mandibles clicked sharply. You used us. Kane's lips pressed into a thin line. We used everyone. The war table still pulsed with remnants of the battle. Ghost signals of Dominion fleets that no longer existed. Distress calls that had been cut off before they could even be answered. The Zalvith had overwhelmed them in days, wiped out entire military strongholds in hours. And then, in the span of minutes, they had been erased. Vakran's claws tapped against the table. Ow! The word hung in the air. It wasn't just a question. It was the question. Kane regarded the room for a long moment before answering. You think warfare is about strength, he said at last. About armies and tactics. But the truth is, war is about control. The Zalvith controlled the battlefield, controlled the fear, controlled the flow of combat. He leaned forward slightly. So we took control of reality itself. A weighted silence followed. Vakran's throat vibrated. Explain. Kane exhaled. You wouldn't understand the specifics, but the short version? We built something a long time ago. Something we never wanted to use. His gaze darkened. Something designed for enemies we couldn't afford to let exist. Korvac narrowed his eyes. And what was that? Kane's voice was calm. Too calm. The ability to remove something so completely that the universe forgets it was ever there. Vakran recoiled slightly. That's impossible. Kane's expression didn't change. So were the Zalvith. The weight of the statement settled over the chamber like a funeral shroud. Korvac's voice was low, dangerous. You erased them. Kane's lips barely twitched. Would you have preferred they stayed? The Thraxian general bared his fangs. That's not the point. What you did, what you just showed us, it means you've been capable of this all along. Kane nodded. Correct. Vakran's eyes narrowed. And yet, you let us believe you were the weakest among us. Sat at the back. Avoided the front lines. Allowed your allies to burn. Kane sighed, rubbing his temples. We don't like using this. We don't like needing this. His gaze flickered back to the war table. The ghost remnants of the Zalvith still fading into nothing. The last time we used it, well, there's a reason no one remembers what happened. Korvac felt something deeply unsettling settle in his gut. You've done this before. Kane didn't answer. He didn't need to. Vakran's claws curled against the table. And if we ever became a threat, Kane's blue eyes met his, calm and unreadable. Then I wouldn't be having this conversation with you. The War Council chamber was deathly silent. For the first time, Korvac felt genuine fear. Not of the Zalvith. Not of an enemy he could fight with blade and blood. Fear of the humans. The ones who always sat at the back. The ones who waited. The ones who, when the time came, simply erased the problem. Korvac inhaled slowly, his instincts warring with his reason. And what now? He asked, his voice quieter than he would have liked. Kane studied him for a long moment. Now. He leaned back slightly. Now you rebuild. Now you tell yourselves that you won this war. That your sacrifices meant something. That your strength mattered. His tone wasn't mocking. It wasn't cruel. It was simply the voice of someone who had seen this before. Vakran exhaled, his mandibles clicking with quiet unease. And you? What will the humans do? Kane smiled, but it was tired. We'll do what we always do. He stood up. We'll go back to the shadows. Back to the places you pretend don't exist. His gaze swept across the chamber one last time, lingering on each of them. And we'll wait. No one spoke. No one dared. Korvac watched as the human admiral turned, leading his officers toward the exit. He had thought himself unshakable, thought that nothing could ever rattle him. He had fought countless wars, had seen entire civilizations rise and fall. But now, as the doors closed behind the departing humans, Korvac realized a terrible, unshakable truth. The strongest species in the galaxy had never been the Thraxians, nor the Zarnok, nor the Dominion. It had always been the ones who waited, the ones who sat at the back,